result, Hell Awaits would quickly sell 100,000 copies, making it a huge hit for Metal Blade. Clearly, this new underground form of metal that we now refer to as thrash was starting to catch on, and soon another band with a familiar face leading the way would join them, as even though he had been kicked out of Metallica, Dave Mustaine wasn't done. Determined not to be a footnote in Metallica's story and to keep himself occupied on the 4-day bus ride back to California after being fired, an angry Dave Mustaine began writing lyrics on the back of a pamphlet by Senator Alan Cranston. The pamphlet in question was on the topic of nuclear disarmament and contained the line, quote, "The arsenal of Megadeth can't be rid," with Megadeth being a unit of measure created so as to discuss the scale of death that would result from nuclear war, with a Megadeth representing the loss of 1 million lives. Mustaine, though, thought it would be an amazing song title. He would, however, decide to rename the song that was inspired by this pamphlet, calling it instead Set the World on Fire, when he decided to use the term as the name of his new band. A band which would consist of, at least for a time, bassist Dave Ellison, drummer Carl Samuelson, and lead guitarist Chris Poland, as the various roles in Megadeth would become a revolving door of sorts to one degree or another over the years. In fact, Chris Poland wasn't even the first lead guitarist in the band, as Dave briefly played with a 19-year-old Kerry King who was mostly there just to help out as he remained dedicated to his own band. Poland and Samuelson's heavy jazz influence, though, would help to shape Megadeth's initial sound, as their debut album, Killing Is My Business, was highly technical and jazzy in nature despite being poorly produced due to the band spending most of the recording budget on heroin, a situation that ensured producer Carrot Fay did not stick around to finish the album because he wasn't being paid. Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good is a fast, aggressive, and very angry album, as Mustaine tried to out-metal Metallica by playing a faster, more technical style. Now, how successful he was in his goal, I leave that up to your own personal taste, as I know for myself I think Megadeth have a couple of really good albums, but to me for the most part their catalog is a bit hit and miss. That all being said, the name Megadeth was not the only time these bands would deal with the threat that nuclear weapons posed to all life, a threat that was especially present during the Cold War. Indeed, thrash metal, with its tendency toward more serious lyrics, touched multiple times on the specter of nuclear destruction, which is really unsurprising since it was something that was a constant threat in the world where these musicians grew up. To understand these bands to some extent, you have to understand the threat of nuclear warfare, and to understand that you need to first go back to the last time the whole world was at war. By that time, total war had become the dominant philosophy in warfare, meaning there were little to no restrictions on where, how, and who weapons were used against. The clearest example of this is the bombing of population centers by both sides during the Second World War, and the ante was only up with the use of atomic bombs against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, the original justification for these types of attacks was to destroy the enemy country's manufacturing capability, thus damaging their ability to make war. Yet, because bombing was so imprecise, collateral damage was also highly likely to happen. This wasn't seen as a problem, though, because they also figured that the untrained civilians who would be terrorized by these activities would break easier than trained soldiers. These civilians, they believed, would then force their government to capitulate. However, this did not seem to be the case when tested in the real world, as none of the bombings of London, Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, or Tokyo brought the war to an end. The threat of cities being bombed, though, only became even more of a threat with the invention of atomic bombs, which was a dangerous enough development when one country held that power, but when two opposing superpowers both wielded that kind of weapon, the consequences of open conflict between the two became even greater. Indeed, within 8 years of the US dropping atomic bombs on Japan, the Soviet Union would develop the even more destructive hydrogen bomb, a weapon that they weren't shy about using the threat of as a way to flex their muscles to gain concessions from neighboring European countries. The risk of mass destruction then was greater than it had been at any other point in human history. Not only did both sides have individual weapons that could wipe whole cities off the map, but they would also build up stockpiles of these nuclear weapons so that each had more than enough to destroy all life on Earth several times over. Their answer to this potentially life-ending threat then was to raise the stakes. The plan that developed to deal with this situation became known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. This boils down to if one side were to use nuclear weapons on the other, they would respond in kind, using nuclear weapons on the offending country. To be clear though, while targeting the other side's nuclear-armed bases was a part of the plan, for the strategy to be truly effective, both had to at the very least believe that the other was targeting their population centers as well. The idea being that neither country could attack the other without the risk of suffering equal to greater consequences. To that end, sub-based nuclear missiles were also developed, with the idea being that even if a nation's land-based nuclear weapons were wiped out, which would also probably mean much of the population of that country had been destroyed as well, the nation that carried out the strike would still suffer the consequences. Now, this strategy relied upon both sides acting rationally, the belief being that no one acting rationally would risk a nuclear first strike in that scenario because it would be risking just as many casualties if not more on their side as a result. It also relied upon any number of other scenarios not happening, or should such scenarios happen, these superpowers would be able to exercise enough restraint before doing something that could end civilization as we knew it. For example, what would happen if there was an accident? Or what would happen should some other power set off a nuclear weapon? These were the threats that everyone in the world had to live with during the Cold War between the United States and the USSR. In response to this ongoing situation, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, a non-profit organization, would use a so-called doomsday clock as a metaphor to describe how close mankind was to causing their own destruction through nuclear weapons. The clock would reflect the current risk of nuclear destruction, with the scientists moving the time closer to midnight every time the risk was heightened. For example, at the start of the 1980s, they released a bulletin moving the clock to 7 minutes to midnight, the closest it had been in over a decade. They would again move it closer to midnight in both 81 and 84, moving it to 4 and 3 minutes to midnight respectively. The reason for these changes was because the scientists believed that now more than ever, both sides were under the delusion that a nuclear war could be limited, as illustrated by both countries developing weapons designed for warfighting instead of war deterrence. The scientists also feared the rising tensions in the world, with the Iran-Iraq war and the conflict in Afghanistan involving the USSR. According to one of the editorials explaining their reasoning, quote, "The entire world is at a threshold. During the last decade, each year seemed to bring us closer to nuclear holocaust. So far, the new decade has seen this trend accelerating." Their fears only increased as they saw communications between the two sides being cut off, exemplified by the US skipping the 1980 Olympic Games and the USSR returning the favor by boycotting the 1984 Games. The threat of nuclear destruction then was a constant one in the world that these musicians grew up in. Not only that, but as we've established during the 80s, while these thrash bands were making music and gaining in popularity, the threat of nuclear warfare not only remained constant but actually increased. So, of course, you can see this reflected across their work. Megadeth, as I've said, took their name from the concept of a system created to count the sheer number of deaths caused by nuclear warfare. But not only that, the song Set the World Afire deals with the seeming inevitability of nuclear destruction, while Rust in Peace Polaris is a song about the sub-launched nuclear ballistic missiles designed to be launched in response to a nuclear attack by the USSR. Their ultimate rivals Metallica would also touch on nuclear warfare multiple times, doing so first at the start of their second album with Fight Fire with Fire, and then revisiting the topic years later at the start of their fourth album with Blackened. Kirk Hammett's former band Exodus, who carried on without him, also had a song on their debut album titled And Then There Were None, which explicitly references being blinded by a nuclear blast as they talk of the world ending in war and how survivors would wish they were dead. Meanwhile, Metallica's friends from New York, Anthrax, would also touch upon nuclear warfare with their song Aftershock, that talks about blind leaders and how the day will come that there will be a red-hot flare and a blast of hot air, and how there will be nowhere to run or hide as the sun turns black. Clearly, then, the ever-present threat of virtually all life on Earth being wiped out by nuclear warfare was something that was on the minds of these musicians who had grown up amidst the Cold War and were currently living through a period of heightened tensions. The election of Ronald Reagan marked the rise of conservatism and religious fundamentalism in the United States. Indeed, the fundamentalist Christian right rose to prominence as a political force at this time thanks to Ronald Reagan openly courting their vote. One of the clearest consequences of this can be seen in how the Reagan administration handled the AIDS epidemic. Reagan, you see, was the president during the first 7 years of the AIDS crisis, a time when the disease was essentially allowed to run completely unchecked, thereby claiming over 89,000 lives in the U.S., a loss of life that you would think should warrant the attention of the President of the United States. Yet, Reagan would not say a single word on the subject to the public. Indeed, there are even tapes from 1982 of Reagan's press secretary and various members of the media actually laughing at Lester Kinsolving, the only reporter who dared to ask about the AIDS crisis. It was more than just failing to speak on the issue in public, though, as Reagan also made sure his administration didn't do anything in response to the crisis either. This included withholding funds from the World Health Organization, who desperately needed the money in that moment as they were actually trying to battle the epidemic. This move was partially because American conservatives believed that the World Health Organization was working against free enterprise, a belief based on the fact that in 1978 the organization had voiced its support for universal healthcare programs, the horror. That was only part of the reason, though, as seemingly a big part of Reagan and his supporters' callous indifference to this loss of life was because they simply did not care about the disease's primary victims, seeing as how gay men, African Americans, and intravenous drug users were the ones most widely being affected by the disease, a situation that would lead Congressman Harry Waxman to rage that, quote, if the same disease had appeared among Americans of Norwegian descent rather than among gay males, the response of both the government and the medical community would be different. A not insignificant reason for this lack of response, then, can be traced back to the religious figures who seemed to relish the opportunity to condemn homosexual activity. For example, Catholic columnist Patrick Buchanan would remark in response to all the deaths that, quote, the sexual revolution has begun to devour its children. It was compassionate responses like this that left the gay community to forge their own response to the crisis. Yet, while this is the most egregious example of the newly empowered religious right, to be clear, the gay community wasn't their only target. Indeed, these fundamentalists increasingly perceive popular culture as a whole as being openly hostile to their Christian values. For example, conservatives specifically condemn music videos for corrupting young people with vulgar and anti-authoritarian messages. Yet, despite their outcry, the medium only grew in stature, which only served to outrage them even more. Clearly, then, a new front in the never-ending culture war was brewing, although this specific theater of the war had been going on since at least the 50s, when fears of Elvis Presley and his degenerate swinging hips led fundamentalist preachers to burn rock and roll records. Rock music then had for the moral crusaders long been a scapegoat for all the world's perceived ills. For example, fundamentalist preacher Fletcher Brothers in his 1987 book The Rock Report would write, quote, sex and drugs equals rock and roll. Rebellion, Satan equals rock and roll. Homosexuality, incest equals rock and roll. Sadomasochism, mutilation equals rock and roll. Suicide, alcohol equals rock and roll. Hopelessness, anti-godliness equals rock and roll. Murder, occultism equals rock and roll. The list goes on and on. And lest you think this the ramblings of a lone kook, another religious conservative, David Nobel, would also declare that, quote, rock music is evil because it is to music what Dada and Surrealism are to art, atheistic, chaotic, nihilistic. Yet as bad and wicked as rock and roll had been, this new phenomenon of heavy metal seemed to be even worse. The older generation were disturbed by all these long-haired kids in their scary metal t-shirts that had scary band names emblazoned upon them. Worse still, heavy metal had gone from being out of sight and out of mind to being virtually everywhere. It was in the malls, on the radios, and even in America's homes as it entered their living rooms thanks to MTV, and was even appearing in their children's bedrooms as they purchased heavy metal records and hung its posters on their walls. This rapid spread of this new, even more rebellious and louder form of rock was a sign then that something was very wrong with their country. The heavy metal music videos in particular featured men wearing women's clothes or wearing makeup. Plus, there was also the blatant sexuality of many of the videos, which was sometimes accompanied by vaguely satanic imagery. It was then in the eyes of the older generation/authority figures that all of this was a sign of widespread societal downfall. In response to such rising concerns, in 1984, the Parents Music Resource Center, or PMRC, was formed by Tipper Gore, wife of then-Senator Al Gore, Susan Baker, who was married to Reagan's Secretary of the Treasury and eventual Secretary of State James Baker, Pam Howar, whose husband was a real estate developer and active member of the Republican Party, and Sally Nevius, whose husband had been appointed Washington City Council chairman by President Nixon. Additionally, their organization was funded by Mike Love of the Beach Boys and Joseph Coors, the owner of the Coors Brewing Company, both of whom had been active supporters of Reagan's presidential candidacy and were also joined by fundamentalist Christian groups in these efforts. One of the stories told as a way of explaining the organization's founding claimed that one day in 1985, Tipper Gore brought her 8-year-old daughter a copy of Prince's Purple Rain, only to be horrified by the sexual content it contained when she finally listened to it. The thing is, as Frank Zappa points out, the album in question was the soundtrack to an R-rated film that had already generated considerable controversy for its sexual content. As a result, the claim that Tipper Gore was shocked by the lyrical content of said album is suspicious at best. Plus, it seems that at a certain point, Tipper would actively participate in the satanic panic, as she would state, quote, "Crimes rooted in devil worship are escalating nationwide. Teenagers and adolescents are most